Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Today's Grand Rounds was planned by CDHE. We're really excited to have our speaker today. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Shaquita Bell to introduce our speaker.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you are not sick of seeing me just yet. I am just introducing today, so I'm really thrilled to introduce Dr. Rhea Boyd. She is a pediatrician, a public health advocate, a scholar. She writes and teaches on relationships between structural racism and equity in health. She has a particular focus on child and public health impacts of harmful policing practices and policies, and she serves as the Chief Medical Officer of San Diego 211, working with navigators to address social needs of San Diegans impacted by chronic illness and poverty. That's a new word for me. And she's the Director of Equity and Justice for the California Children's Trust, which is an initiative to advance mental health access to children and youth across California. On a personal note, she's one of my favorite people in the whole world, and I was really thankful that she agreed to come back to Seattle Children's, come back virtually, and give us another Grand Rounds in this calendar year, just because she's amazing and such a great speaker. So, Rhea, Dr. Boyd, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. It is really an honor to be back. Thank you guys so much for having me twice in 1 year, which is so cool. I was hoping that I'd get to meet you guys all in person, but I know in the future that is coming. Today, we're going to talk about an anti-racist imperative for pediatrics and for kind of clinical medicine broadly, and what I mean by an anti-racist imperative, what I mean when we talk about the urgency of anti-racist approaches to our clinical work. I shared on this first slide my Twitter handle, which is also my Gmail address. So if you just add @Gmail to the end, if people have other questions we don't have time to get to, please feel free to reach out to me. I don't have any disclosures. So let's start here. If we're going to talk about the urgency of anti-racism in our field, we have to begin by recognizing the burden and the toll that racism takes on communities. This is a quote from author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates from his book, Between the World and Me. He says, "But all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. We must never look away from this. We must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body." It's critical that we begin here, because whether we are talking about the physical violence of policing or the structural violence of inaccessible healthcare, the implications of racism are profound for the lived experience of folks who suffer under its burdens. As colleagues and I summarized in our article in Health Affairs this past summer, racism remains a bloodying force, structuring every facet of American life, and if we're honest, every facet of medicine, including pediatrics. And so today, we are going to talk about racism from the lens of diversity and inclusion. We're going to start there because usually in medical centers, the work around diversity inclusion is the context in which we discuss anti-racism and is often the administrative home for anti-racist strategic work. And so we're going to talk about that home and how it functions and challenge symbolic forms of diversity and inclusion that don't meet the standard of true anti-racist practice. So to begin the story, I think in medicine, we have to begin here. This is the start of our journey with diversity and inclusion. This is a picture of Alan Bakke, who in 1973 was a 33-year-old white male. And in that year, he applied to 12 medical schools, including UC Davis. That year, he was denied admission to all 12 schools, and 2 schools even cited his age as the reason for admission. Back then, age discrimination wasn't the issue that it is today. In 1974, after being denied from all 12 medical schools, he again applies to UC Davis, and he's rejected again. He goes on sued UC Davis that year, claiming that their special admissions program discriminated against it. In 1973, UC Davis had two admissions programs, the general admissions program and the special admissions program. The general admissions program had a GPA cutoff of 2.5, below which all candidates were summarily denied. The special admissions program had no GPA cutoff, and it was intended for applicants who self-identified as, quote, economically or educationally disadvantaged or, quote, minority groups. Despite its existence for 4 years before Bakke applied to UC Davis, and despite multiple white students applying to the special admissions program, 0 were admitted through that program's existence. And so he sues UC Davis to say that that program discriminated against him and other white applicants based on their race. The decision went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1978, Justice Powell issued the decision of the court. This was a controversial decision that really fractured the court. Of the 9 justices, each issued 6 different opinions. But Justice Powell issued the summarizing opinion of the court. And in his opinion, he offers language that begins to become the inflection point that we have followed in clinical medicine and in pediatrics when we talk about racism. What he said is that for schools like UC Davis, racial and ethnic classifications of any sort are inherently suspect and call for the most exacting judicial scrutiny if you're going to use them to determine who gets to be admitted to your school or who gets to participate in the activity. But he says the goal of achieving a diverse student body is sufficiently compelling to justify consideration of race in admissions under some circumstances. This is a critical shift in language. Instead of talking about racial exclusion or discrimination as the primary mechanisms of racism that excluded folks of color from admissions to medical schools and participation in a number of public goods, instead, he says what's really important to focus on is diversity. And as long as race serves the goal of diversifying, in this case, UC Davis's medical school, then the school could use race as partly a consideration in admissions, but not the quotas that they were using before. His colleagues join him in their adjoining opinion by saying the purpose of overcoming chronic minority underrepresentation in the medical profession is sufficiently important to justify the petitioner's remedial use of race. In these statements, we see the introduction of language that have then become the foundation for how we think about racial exclusion and discrimination. We typically talk about it as an affront to diversity and as an issue of minority, quote, underrepresentation. So we're going to talk more about how that language has served and disserved us in addressing racism. First, immediately there were protests. This is a picture of a protest from UC Davis's campus. But the protest honestly spanned the nation because it was clear that once this decision came down from the Supreme Court, that the implications weren't just for medical schools or even for educational settings. The implications were that if affirmative action couldn't stand at UC Davis, it meant that other efforts to redress forms of racial exclusion and discrimination were also being challenged, including those efforts to redress discrimination and exclusion in employment and housing. And so today, we're going to go through a little bit of an arc in how we talk about our anti-racist approaches to pediatrics. We're going to start by talking about what really anchors the diversity and inclusion paradigm by focusing on that language around representation. We're then going to talk about the limitations of that paradigm to actually help us confront racism and its many manifestations. And then we're going to talk about what it would look like for us to build an anti-racist path to the future of pediatrics. So let's start with the anchors. When we think about the politics of representation, I think sometimes it's helpful to go to other fields that have written more extensively about it than we have. And so I turn to the social sciences, where they've clearly outlined the different types of representation. I think of these types as developmental stages. You know, we're all pediatricians and we tend to think in that way anyway. So I'm going to present them to you as ways that organizations typically begin their approach to diversity and inclusion and the goal that they should be moving towards. So most organizations begin their approach to diversity and inclusion with symbolic representation. Symbolic representation holds that the mere presence of someone from an under, quote, represented group has meaning, it has value. Descriptive representation holds that institutions should demographically reflect the populations they serve. Substantive representation says, despite the makeup of an institution, the institution should always act in the interests of the populations they serve, not just the interests of the populations that comprise their workforce. So symbolic representation typically is manifest in statements around an institution's values. Often that can live in someone's mission statement. Descriptive representation usually becomes these numerical benchmarks or goals that organizations set to know that they are progressing in addressing historical exclusion in their institution. But substantive representation is the only form that actually centers around true systems change. And so we're going to go through now each form of representation and talk about the ways that it can serve us, but also disserve us in our work to address racism directly. So first, starting with symbolic representation. Symbolic representation was historically incredibly valuable when there still was legal or de jure discrimination. When discrimination based on racial background was outlawed, then when organizations would allow one person or two people from a previously excluded racial group to join the workforce or participate in the activity, it was an important sign that organizations were complying with new laws. But the problem with only allowing one or two people to join the organization or activity is that it creates the public perception that the organization intends to admit or welcome more folks. Here, I think an important example to rely on is what's been happening in US medical schools. So if we look starting 2 years after the Bakke decision to 2016, you see that the racial composition of medical school matriculants based on their racial and ethnic background has barely changed. It's increased a little more than 2% over that more than 30-year time period. This is despite the fact that space, actual seats in medical schools, have increased 27% over that time. And so if we look more closely at the change that has happened, right? Seats opened up, but the racial composition of medical schools didn't really change. So what changed? What we see is on the left, the racial composition of US matriculants to medical schools in 1980. And on the right is a comparison for 2016. And if we look at the light blue curve, which is white students, you see that there was a big change, that white students decreased from the vast majority, more than 80%, to just over half of medical school matriculants in 2016. If you then look along the side at the populations that then make up that other half, you see that it's predominantly now Asians who went from 4% to 21.3%. If you look at American Indian, Alaska Native, or Indigenous populations, you see that they actually decreased their representation in medical schools over that time. Black or African American students increased slightly. Hispanic or Latinx students increased slightly more than that. And if you'll note, the other category increased about 11%. The other category represents non-US citizens, non-permanent residents, folks who have unknown race, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and folks who have multi-race. So it would be helpful if AAMC would have disaggregated that category for us, but still it's never more than the Asian category or the white category or any of the other racial groups. So then AAMC said, well, what are some of the barriers that might be facing Black students in particular, such that they're not more represented in medical schools? And what they found is that if you look at admissions rates, Black or African American students have the lowest acceptance rate among other groups, which in this report had the AAMC question ways that Black students in particular may be still excluded from medical schools. If we fast forward to the most recent year for which we have data, we see that white students, this red half of the curve, continue to make up about half of US medical schools. And Asian students, that turquoise block, continue to make up about 1/5 or 20% of US medical school students. And the other groups are virtually unchanged. If we then look over that pipeline to which of those students then end up actually as faculty in medical schools, you see that white faculty are the majority of faculty in US medical schools, the green part of the curve. And the second racial group is again Asians. So the fact that we have this preponderance of white medical students and a majority of the other groups of Asian students who make up a US medical schools, we see that reflected directly in who has the opportunity to then be faculty at US medical schools. If we look at all active trainees, this is data from ACGME, we also see that reflected in who gets to train across all the medical specialties, pediatrics included, that the vast majority of residents, 42.3%, are white, 17.8% are Asian or Pacific Islander, 5% about are Latinx, 4% about are Black, 0.2% are American Indian, Alaska Native, or Indigenous, and about 25% are unknown or multiracial. And so I even went to try to find what the racial makeup is of current pediatric trainees with the American Board of Pediatrics. And it was interesting to find that they only report diversity as it relates to gender and not race openly on their website. And so let's go back into symbolic representation. The other use of it is it's often used to establish the organizational perception that diversity is valued, right? So if you include even just a couple of people, you're able to say, we're doing this because we value diversity. But the problem with that is it's often used to then demean people's inclusion as if the only reason that they're included is because they're from this kind of, quote, underrepresented or othered group. The other benefit of symbolic representation is it allows organizations to construct this progress narrative that advances the notion of fairness, right? It used to be that zero, for example, African Americans participated in pediatrics as clinicians, and now we have around a few percent, less than 4% or less. And so it's getting, quote unquote, better. The problem with progress narratives is it comforts those who are already served well by this system, right? It soothes the conscious to think that things are getting better at the expense of those who continue to be poorly served by the system, those who continue to be excluded. A good example of the failings of symbolic representation happened over the summer when the CEO of Wells Fargo joined 4 other Wall Street CEOs in decrying the violence that had happened over the summer to George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and even noting the violence that had happened to Asian Americans, which continues to increase, especially here in my home city of San Francisco. And he closed his statement saying, basically, as a CEO of Wells Fargo, I can commit that our company will do all we can to support diverse communities and foster a community culture that deeply values and respects diversity and inclusion. He made that statement publicly in June. Merely weeks after he made that statement, in a private meeting that was then disclosed to the Washington Post, he then made this comment. While it might sound like an excuse, the unfortunate reality is there's a very limited pool of Black talent to recruit from when talking about why Wells Fargo doesn't have, or maybe the better way to say it is, continues to exclude Black folks from their workforce. So symbolic diversity can live in statements of values, but it's much more important that it actually translates into the system work necessary to stop excluding people from the workforce. And sometimes when we only go to symbolic lengths, we then kind of betray our true values, which are that we don't actually intend to make substantive changes, which I think Wells Fargo's CEO was appropriately criticized for doing. So now let's talk about descriptive representation. When we focus on numbers as benchmarks for how we're doing in addressing racism and furthering diversity within our institutions, we can often do that by creating structural lanes for folks who were previously excluded. But the problem when we create these unique lanes that we sometimes call pipelines is that it fails to actually restructure the predominant mode of entry that is exclusionary still. And so we will create this separate lane for inclusion, but leave untouched the rest of the superstructure that still predominantly excludes folks who are excluded by their racial status. A great example of that has been what's happened historically in US public schools. This is a picture of Ruby Bridges in 1960. She was 6 years old, and on that day, she was desegregating her elementary school, William Franz Elementary, in New Orleans, Louisiana. What's notable about Ruby Bridges' story is that Brown v. Board passed the Supreme Court in 1954. And yet Ruby Bridges was the first student to desegregate the elementary school in New Orleans 6 years later. When we focus on that, what you see is that there were Black students who continued to go to segregated schools after the passage of Brown v. Board, some like Ruby, for up to 6 years after the passage. I just started reading this beautiful book White Rage by Carol Anderson, professor of African American Studies at Emory University, that goes over the histories of how white supremacy has been carried out through legal processes. And the failure to fully desegregate schools with, quote, all deliberate speed, which is what the Supreme Court called for in the year following Brown v. Board, is a profound example of how we don't actually, when we create separate lanes, that we don't actually try to dismantle the larger system that continues to exclude students of color. In White Rage, Carol Anderson gives a really devastating example of a county in Virginia, Prince George County, that rather than desegregate schools, actually closed every single public school in the county for 5 years. And it wasn't until the 1970s that that county in Virginia actually integrated their schools. What we see is that even today, this is an article from ProPublica that charts the resegregation of US schools. It came out in 2018. And basically, you see that in areas of the country where predominantly Black folks live, Black students predominantly go to schools with other Black students. That's where you see the darkening blue on the map. Those are also the areas where Black students are academically more behind. And the darker it gets, the more grade level students are behind. This is because, as the Supreme Court declared more than 70 years ago, separate is always unequal. And so what we see is that when students are in segregated schools, which continues to be the case, their academic performance is a reflection of the lack of resources that they have at their schools. We see the same phenomenon happening for Latinx students who, in areas of the country that predominantly Latinx populations live, tend to attend schools that are predominantly Latinx, and the impact that that then has on their academic achievement. Academic achievement really matters. So I'll briefly just say, as pediatricians, we care a ton about academic achievement because for students who are grade levels behind, they are at increased risk of dropping out of school and not enrolling in college or continuing beyond high school. And every year that students lose in high school actually shortens their life expectancy. So the fact that we have failed to actually fully integrate US public schools is actually shortening the life expectancy of students of color. So the other benefit of descriptive representation is it allows folks to offer numerical goals as a benchmark for success, which we love in our quote unquote evidence-based field. But the problem with these benchmarks for success is that it misnames quote underrepresentation as the primary issue. We're going to come back to that point. The other benefit of descriptive representation is that folks often use it to employ the business case of diversity, that as the population quote unquote browns, organizations should kind of demographically reflect that population so that we can capture their market share. But again, this is fundamentally a misnaming, as if the problem of the exclusion of folks from our institutions is primarily one that's financial in scope, when truly the problem is racism. When we rely just on numbers, we miss this fact. This was an article that came out in the New York Times in September 2020 that acknowledged that if you look across influential sectors across the US, the faces of power, 80% are white, even as our nation becomes more quote unquote diverse. If we look within the halls of medicine, we see that across hospitals, this is data from the American Hospital Association that was released last year, we see the same happening in our US hospitals, that essentially the faces of power who are in hospital leadership and governance are predominantly white, which are the bars to the left side. They've also put in bars, the blue bar on this chart are patients. And so you can compare who's kind of quote unquote overrepresented or underrepresented among leadership. But what is overwhelmingly the takeaway is that white folks make up the faces of power in our US hospitals too. Then if we look at the leadership positions that folks of color or minority quote unquote groups tend to occupy, it's much more common for folks to be invited into an executive position to then manage the fact that the organization has excluded folks who look like them as the chief diversity officer, rather than occupying the other C-suite roles. Again, this is data from the American Hospital Association. And it's not just the C-suite. The AHA also looked at board membership and mid-level managers, and they looked over time. So if you look from 2011 to 2015, you can see that among executive leadership, among hospital CEOs, among hospital boards, and among mid-level managers in the hospital, white folks make up the vast majority of folks who are in leadership positions, and that has barely changed over the last decade. It matters that white folks are in more positions of power, obviously because that allows them to make decisions, but because it also puts them in a different financial position than every other person of color who works in that institution, regardless of their level. That then becomes reflected in the racial wage gaps that exist in healthcare. And the widest racial wage gap is between white male physicians and Black female clinicians. So let's talk about substantive representation, because that's where we all need to move as organizations. So the benefit of substantive representation is that it allows us to abandon group affiliation. We can say it doesn't matter who the composition of our workforce is, we still have to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the population that we are serving. But the problem with that is that we don't want to reify the dominant order. So we don't want to say, well, we don't need to include anybody. We can just do this on our own without including the voices and the input of the folks who have been historically excluded, because that then silences those who are already oppressed in our systems. So we have to balance the fact that we must do things now, regardless of our makeup, with the fact that we also have to respond to the ways that racism has excluded folks. The other benefit of substantive representation is it allows us to use institutional language, processes, and resources to address racial inequity. It allows us to talk about systems. But we never want to talk about systems so much that we miss the fact that we as individuals make choices every day at a project level, at a department level, maybe even just as the leader of a clinical team, that allows us to also control the climate and the functioning of our larger organization. And so individuals, we also have to understand, are change agents. And so something is also called for us to be doing to address racism. Finally, substantive representation allows us to focus as institutions on both actions, but also our inactions, which then come to define our values. So symbolic representation would just openly state our values with nothing to back it up. But substantive representation calls us to actually use your actions or inactions to define what your values are. But we have to be careful to ensure that this is not a singular destination, but instead an iterative process where actions will have to continue to change over time, just as racism and its manifestations continue to evolve over time. A great example of substantive representation is happening here in San Francisco, where our county hospital is actually considering severing their relationship with the sheriff's department. And I just include some language there because it frames how you might approach substantive representation. Instead of talking about who works at the hospital, the very first questions in their document is, who do we serve and who do we protect? And they go on to acknowledge that when you entangle sheriff presence within our medical care, it presumes that the concept of safety requires armed law enforcement for all, which is an assumption that invariably leads to harm for many. That centering systems change around the needs of the patient population that you serve is the right approach to substantive representation. And so now we're going to talk about how the diversity and inclusion paradigm and how, in particular, symbolic approaches to diversity and inclusion limit our ability to actually move towards anti-racism. So returning to that language from the Supreme Court, we have to acknowledge that the quote, substantial chronic minority underrepresentation in the medical profession doesn't come from nowhere. It actually arises from a long and bloody history of exclusion and white hegemony in this country. That bloody history did not begin on January 6th. But if we were students of history, we would have recognized that January 6th was possible because we were also the nation in which violent mobs have attacked over our nation's history, Black folks. This is an article from St. Petersburg, Florida from 1954. And I want to read the case that it is discussing. So this is, I'm reading now from The Warmth of Other Suns, an incredible book by Isabel Wilkerson. This is a national bestseller. It's a Pulitzer Prize winner. This is an excellent book. So this article here is covering this case. She says, that October, a 23-year-old colored farmhand named Claude Neal was accused of the rape and murder of a 20-year-old white woman named Lola Kennedy. Neal had grown up across the road from Lola Kennedy's family. He was arrested and signed a written confession that historians have since called into question. But at the time, passions ran so high that a band of more than 300 men, armed with guns, knives, torches, and dynamite, went searching for Neal in every jail within a 75-mile radius of Marianna. The manhunt forced the authorities to move Neal across the Panhandle, from Marianna to Panama City by car, to Camp Walton by boat, to Pensacola by car again, with the mob on their trail at every turn. Finally, the Escambia County Sheriff, fearing that his jail in Pensacola was too dilapidated to withstand attack, decided to take Neal out of the state altogether, to the tiny town of Bruton, Alabama, 55 miles north of Pensacola. Someone leaked Neal's whereabouts, and a lynching party of some 100 men drove several hours on Highway 231 in a 30-car caravan from Florida to Alabama. There, the men managed to divert the local sheriff and overtake the deputy. They stormed the jail and took Neal, his limbs bound with a plow rope, back to Marianna. For folks for whom this may be triggering, I will say, what I'm going to read reflects the violence of what happened to Claude Neal, which is one of the most egregious lynchings in NAACP's history of prosecuting these violent crimes. As Isabel Wilkerson says, it was the early morning hours of October 26, a Friday. Neal's chief objectors, a self-described committee of 6, set the lynching for 8 p.m., when almost everyone would be off work. The advance notice allowed word to spread by radio, teletype, and afternoon papers to the Western time zones. Well before the appointed hour, several thousand people had gathered at the lynching site. The crowd grew so large and unruly, people had been given sufficient forewarning to come in from other states, that the Committee of 6, fearing a riot, took Neal to the woods by the Tupelo River to wait out the crowds and torture him before the execution. There, his captors took knives and castrated him in the woods. Then they made him eat the severed body parts. Quote, and say he liked it, a witness said. One man at the site. Around Neal's neck, they tied a rope and pulled it over a limb to the point of his choking before lowering him to take up the torture again. Every now and then, somebody would cut off a finger or toe, a witness said. Then the men used hot irons to burn him all over his body in a ritual that went on for hours. Quote, it is almost impossible to believe that a human being could stand such unspeakable torture for such a long period. The crowd waiting in town never got to see Neal die. The Committee of 6 decided finally to kill him in the woods. His nude body was then tied to the back of a car and dragged to the Kennedy house, where men, women, and children stabbed the corpse with sticks and knives. The committee hanged the body from an oak tree on the courthouse lawn. People reportedly displayed Neal's fingers and toes as souvenirs. Postcards of his dismembered body went for 50 cents each. When the sheriff refused to return the body to the tree, the mob attacked the courthouse and rampaged through Marianna, attacking any colored person they ran into. Florida Governor David Schultz had to call in the National Guard. The NAACP compiled a 16-page report and more files on the Neal case than any other lynching in American history. Soon after, it was learned that Neal and the dead girl, who had known each other all their lives, had been lovers, and that people in her family who discovered the liaison may have been involved in her death, for the shame that it brought the family. Violence had become such an accepted fact of life in Florida that even by 1950, the Florida governor's special investigator observed that there had been so many mob executions in one county that it, quote, never had a Negro live long enough to go to trial. I want us to just take a second there. When we talk about diversity and inclusion, we often talk about the, quote, uncomfortable conversations. We talk about what it might feel like for some people to talk about including people in the workforce. What we don't talk about is the abject violence and terrorism Black folks, Indigenous folks, and folks of color have been subject to in this country for centuries that continues today, right up to January 6th. And so we have to ask ourselves, how has this home we've created for our anti-racist work, the diversity and inclusion paradigm, engaged this bloody and unjust history of racial exclusion and white hegemony in our country? If you turn to symbolic diversity and inclusion, it responds to this abject violence by saying that we should celebrate the first people who get to be included, or by erecting this notion that some minorities are better than others. Asian students and Asian faculty are often subject to confronting this myth that they perform race in a way that other people should, and that because other groups cannot, that's why they're excluded. Descriptive diversity and descriptive forms of representation try to respond to this violent history by just including more people in promotional materials for our institutions, or trying to just allow more people to sit around a table where decisions are made. It's truly only substantive representation that allows us to name racism and the violence that it has created within our institutions and in our communities, and to fix racism as a part of systems change. When you look at public institutions' mission statements, this is an article from 2012. It found that it's incredibly common for institutions to mention diversity in their mission statements. About 3 out of every 4 do. And yet only 1 out of every 5 actually define that diversity in racial and ethnic terms. There was a report on diversity in the pediatric workforce published in Pediatrics around this same time in 2011 that also called for a, quote, broadening of how we frame diversity beyond just racial and ethnic terms. There is this idea that how we address diversity doesn't actually have to contend primarily, fundamentally, with racism and talk about the humans who have been excluded as a result of that racism. Since May 2020, something has shifted, especially in medicine. If we look particularly at the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, of which the AAP is a part, but it includes all of the professional organizations of which physicians are a part, and about 800,000 physicians, they release statements deploring the negative impact of racism and its impacts on public health. And of their member organizations, 43 members, including the AAP, released statements acknowledging racism and its harms just since May 2020. The Children's Hospital Association of the United States released a similar statement acknowledging the violence that had happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and our nation's long history of racism, and calling for children's hospitals to do more about it. To my knowledge, there were no national medical associations or hospital associations that have released statements publicly acknowledging white supremacy and the ways that it is deeply intertwined in the forms of racism that ensnare communities and continue to exclude folks from participation in our workforce and from benefiting from equal access to healthcare. And so the real failures of symbolic and descriptive approaches to diversity and inclusion is that they don't give us language that we need to talk about race as a product of racism and the racial hierarchy that's created by white supremacy. And they don't give us a process to actually combat racism and the hierarchy that's created by white supremacy. And so without that language to understand racial inequity as a product of racism, we have this collective and deep aversion to confronting white hegemony in medicine and pediatrics, white supremacy, white privilege, and white normativity. And I'm just going to define these terms because it's critical that when we talk about the violent history of racism, that we use the appropriate term. So these are all forms of racial exclusion and discrimination. White hegemony is a form of racial exclusion and discrimination that establishes and enforces racial hierarchies in which white folks nearly exclusively hold decision-making power. White supremacy refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that create and maintain a racial order of humans and resources that reinforce the racial dominance of whites. If we look at our children's hospitals, for example, they would reflect a white hegemony, and honestly, a white patriarchal hegemony, because most of the folks who are CEOs and executives of our children's hospitals are white men. White supremacy is then an ideology or a belief system that reinforces the notion that white folks are dominant because they have more. White privilege refers to forms of racial exclusion and discrimination that preferences white people through disproportionate access to resources associated with mobility. And white normativity then naturalizes power asymmetries between white and non-white folks as being primarily meritocratic. This is where we say, well, the reason white folks have more positions of power, or the reason our trainee class is predominantly white, is because they deserve it more, or they met certain criteria that other people were unable to meet. So if we don't have a defined process to actually address racial inequality as a product of racism and white supremacy, then we essentially disconnect that long and bloody history of racism and white supremacy in this country from its many intergenerational harms. These harms have never been more evident than during this pandemic, where despite the fact that we recognized racial health inequities early in this pandemic, we continue to see, even just over the last month of data from APM Research Labs, that those inequities are widening. We see that reflected in who has access to the COVID vaccine. This is again from APM Research Lab, and it's looking at states and the percentage of their population who has had at least one dose of the vaccine. And if you compare it to that figure that we saw earlier about where students go to schools that are predominantly segregated, you'll see that the areas of the country that predominantly folks of color live in are those who are least likely to have populations who have had at least one dose of the vaccine. We similarly see, this was just released by CDC last week, that those areas of the country that are least likely to have one dose of the vaccine, which are also the areas where folks of color predominantly live, are also the places where children who have multi-inflammatory syndrome live. And of the children with multi-inflammatory syndrome, we know that 75% are Latinx or Black. This is again from the CDC. And so this is a slide from our first presentation together, the last time I was there, that just reflects all of the structural factors or the ways that structural racism has absolutely shaped this pandemic, and the ways that it does that, not just for our health now, but also ways that impact the health of our future generations intergenerationally. And so what would it mean for an anti-racist future? We're going to close over the next 5 minutes just thinking about how we can move towards substantive approaches to anti-racism. So first, we have to acknowledge that simply valuing difference, symbolic approaches to diversity and inclusion will not fix racism. This is data from the New York Times from 2017 that looked at how the state of affirmative action in higher education today. And what it shows is that even just 2 years after Bakke to 2015, you see that white students and Asians continue to be disproportionately included in higher education. And Latinx students and Black students continue to be disproportionately excluded from higher education. We also have to acknowledge that valuing difference is not an antidote to racism. So even if we have statements or even if we express what our values are around diversity and inclusion, we have to actually translate that into work to address racial exclusion. So this is data from the AHA that looks at the hospitals who collect data from their patient populations around race and ethnicity, and it looks how they use that data. And what I'll point out, which is most alarming, is that only 8% of hospitals that actually collect data around race and ethnicity use it to understand people who have medical errors in the hospital. So there are ways that we operate as systems where we continue to, despite these declarations of our values, not actually target the ways that racism harms populations when they're in our care. And we have to acknowledge that simple inclusion doesn't fix racism either. Even if we were to have an acceptable or desirable or whatever the sufficient number of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx professionals of color within our organizations are that have been historically excluded, it doesn't change the actual norms and policies of our organizations. Like the number itself is not what's doing the work. And when we invite folks into our institutions without doing the work inside our institutions to make it a welcoming, loving, nurturing place for them to work, then people are either asked to assimilate to the institutional norms and complicitly participate in forms of racism that might even just look like inaction in the face of need, to quote Kamara Jones, or we silence their voices as they try to speak up about the ways that the institution actually has to change, not just their inclusion has to change. The other side is that we tend to include folks from previously excluded groups and then ask them to do the uncompensated and often completely invisible labor of transforming the institution. We showed that figure earlier from the AHA that showed that when folks of color do ascend to C-suite positions, that they often are asked to be the chief diversity officer, right? Or when folks want to work on diversity issues, they join a committee that's work is predominantly ad hoc. It's not considered in their promotion within the academic center, and they're not compensated for their time. And so we have to acknowledge that those things have to change, and the institution has to transform itself for us to actually address racism. Including people is not enough. The problem with us focusing on inclusion in this way is it actually substitutes the symptom that people aren't there for the etiology. They aren't there because we still have forms of racism in our selection process for who gets to participate in our workforce or benefit from our healthcare. And so it's critical that we acknowledge that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx and other professionals of color are not underrepresented. So we have to stop using that term. It isn't that they just magically aren't there or they just benignly aren't there. They are excluded. When you aren't there, it's evidence of an active process to keep you from being there. And that process is often the criteria that we use to determine who's deserving of the opportunity of inclusion. And when included, as we just covered, it's often within systems that have historically demeaned, devalued, or discriminated against folks who look like them. And so when we go through this process of excluding people, it becomes intergenerational. It becomes its own pipeline of exclusion. And so we have to move from symbolic to substantive forms of anti-racism. To do that, we have to be able to name racism, identify how it works, and eliminate it. When it comes to naming racism, we as a health system have done a poor job historically. A 2018 systematic review found that over a 13-year period from 2002 to 2015, only 25 articles actually named institutional racism in the 50 highest impact journals across medicine, and institutionalized racism was only a core concept in 16 of those 25 articles. Last night, I just went through Pediatrics and did a short search myself and found that over that same time period, only 46 articles named racism. This included articles, policy statements, and clinical and technical reports. In total, there were 182 articles that named racism over the journal's history, but 52 of those articles were written in 2020 or just this year. After you name racism as a driver of the reason why people are excluded, we have to acknowledge the ways that racism works. And this is a pearl from the last time I spoke with you, that racism operates through legacies and practices of racial exclusion, discrimination, disinvestment, and violence. And sometimes when we think about those legacies, we miss how proximate they may be to current practices, which I think is captured well by this devastating image of having the Confederate flag in our nation's capital, right alongside supporters of a current or of the last administration. If we fail to identify how racism works, we then can sometimes participate in patient blame. When you don't actually name racism as the driver of racial health inequities or people's exclusion from the workforce, we sometimes blame people for the reason that they were excluded or the reason they have poor outcomes. And I just want to say this briefly because I hear this language coming up again around the vaccine. A common and accepted manifestation of patient blame is the ways that we've been focusing on patient mistrust as a driver of racial health inequities. As colleagues and I said in Health Affairs this summer, while patient trust absolutely drives healthcare use behaviors and is an important part of the patient-physician relationship, incessant, persistent racial health inequities across nearly every major health index reveals less about what patients have failed to feel and more about what our systems have failed to do. To be clear, patient trust won't solve racial health inequities. And even if patients trust us, it won't mean that they necessarily won't get COVID, right? Trust is not the barrier. The barrier is racism, and we have to eliminate racism and the ways that it shapes disproportionate exposures that increase, for example, exposure to infectious disease like COVID. And so we have to start contending with abolition, which is a term I raised the last time that we talked. Here's a figure we usually think about for abolition, right? That we should move from just equal interventions, which some might say are relatively symbolic, to equitable interventions, which focus on the numbers and try to provide resources commensurate with need, to then focus on liberation, which is kind of the getting rid of the fence. But if we turn to Angela Davis's words in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? I think this image has really become a reflection of how difficult it is for us to envision a social order that doesn't rely on the threat of sequestering people in places designed to separate them from activities that are life affirming, right? It's difficult for us to envision resource allocation beyond a social order that always includes the fence. And so to adequately talk about abolishing racism, we actually have to change our vantage point. This is an incredible paper by colleagues Nicholas Barcelo at UCLA, who acknowledge that if we actually center at the margins, you can't see what's on the other side of the fence. And also acknowledge that nobody's just innately short. People don't have resources, not because they're shorter, but because their communities are divested in, which is that hole, or because folks are ensnared in the criminal justice system. And then while certain folks are held back, other folks are artificially advantaged, like the person who has the box to look over. And so we have to confront the ways that inequality is constructed and perpetuated. I want to leave time for questions, so we're going to stop here. But there are a few other slides that I'll just click through, and I'll share these slides as well that just talk through other approaches that we could take to move towards substantive representation. That includes mandated education. It includes being conscious of folks who are racially excluded from our institutions as we include them. And it includes the concept of sanctuary, that we should actually make our institutions a place for sanctuary for our patients and for the doctors that we work alongside. Ultimately, to heal as a form of system change work, we have to participate in truth, reconciliation, and reparations. That process should look like unlearning and dismantling that happens simultaneously alongside processes to reimagine and build what pediatric care can look like. And it should feel like loving sanctuary from forms of oppression and passive harms when patients seek our care and when we all show up at work every day.
I always learn something new when we talk, and I thank you for being in this space with us. There's a lot of asking for your slides and saying how great your talk is in the chat. I did see one question, which, honestly might be a little unfair to you. I know that you and I talked a little bit about the anti-racist strategic plan for Seattle Children's, anti-racist organizational change strategic plan. The person in the chat asked if we are reinforcing the progress narrative that you outlined when we talk about increasing the percentage of diverse hires in the workforce. I know we only got to talk about it a little bit, but I think if it's okay with you, I might answer the question. Do you mind pulling up your substantive change slide that showed the benefits and risks? when I think of our AROC strat plan, I think about how multi-dimensional it is. So one of the things Dr. Boyd mentioned was addressing policing and how that is a part of our strategic plan here at Seattle Children's. I think the takeaways I'm getting from your talk, Dr. Boyd, is that a lot of this stuff needs to be done in concert. So we want to address, well, first of all, we're using the term anti-racism to be very specific. And instead of a blanket statement saying we support Black Lives Matters or something like that, we're actually using the term anti-racism, but I'm going to add white supremacy, white hegemony, white privilege. I wrote that down. But that it's multifactorial, right? So we're looking at who is at the table, who's in leadership positions. Specifically, our diversity goals are around leadership and not just matching our patient population across the board. But additionally, we're looking at things like how do we police patients in the hospital, criminal background checks, calling police on parents and family members. We're looking at policies around hate speech and what does that mean to be a member of our team and use that language or that discrimination. So the way I look at it, and I feel like I'm talking too much now, is that substantive change really means that you're not doing one thing and considering yourself done, that it is an iterative process, that you're continuing to look at all the different ways that that racism and white supremacy impacts your organization.
I think that's brilliant. Absolutely. I think it's an iterative process, and we have to be mindful of the ways that we celebrate our wins, because sometimes those celebrations can ring hollow to people who are still crying out for major changes.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that question and you filling folks in.
Are you seeing the chat now? I see a couple.
Oh yeah, I see. Let me see. Do you have suggestions on how we can push to get paid for the DEI work we're doing within our organizations? So a lot of people ask me this. I mean, I always, when I present on this topic, say that we need to pay people to do this work, that it actually is work that's of value to our organizations, that this is work that's of value to our hospitals, that these will become part of ACGME requirements. This is what the American Board of Pediatrics is even looking at for us to continue to recertify, that we're doing education around anti-racism and that we are making real changes. So I think one way to do it is just to get a little bit more organized and make a set of demands and have those demands actually have repercussions if those demands aren't met. So some people who are predominantly doing the work can sometimes even withhold your labor or strike until you get people who are willing to support the work in the ways that it should be. But I think getting organized is really helpful. Let's see. Sabrine said, instead of historically marginalized, I like, quote, furthest from health justice, instead of medical mistrust, lack of earned trust, just alternatives because words matter. I agree. It sounds like other folks also agree. Joseph Sherman says, what are the first concrete measures a white supremacy institution can do to create an anti-racist culture which welcomes leaders of color to enter without sabotaging them? I think the first concrete measure is truth. So in the process of truth, reconciliation, and reparations is that institutions have to be clear and take a true investigative process. They have to be clear about ways that they have participated in, benefited from, or remained passive around forms of institutional racism. So institutions have to be transparent to everybody else. Like, this is what we've been doing wrong. We acknowledge it. We've gone through a process to learn about it. And then share that that has happened, apologize for that. And then your strategic plan should directly address every item of the ways the institution has benefited from, participated in, furthered, or simply just not done anything to address racism and thus participated in it. I think it's a critical way to begin. I'll also say, and I know we're running out of time, that we throw this word anti-racism around, but everybody couldn't be further from anti-racism, right? We are just beginning the process of learning about terms, about being honest about the racially disparate impact our policies have and the violence that that has had on communities. So we are at the beginning state, everyone. I don't know any organization that is truly anti-racist in healthcare. And it's why towards the end of the slides, I point out the business model many of our academic medical centers have that further racism. So first, I think we have to acknowledge that we are not close and that it will take a long-term investment and not simply like an incremental low-hanging fruit change to really get there.
Thank you so much for coming again. On behalf of CDHE, it's a pleasure. I hope we can make this like a yearly event, at least maybe twice a year if we keep it up. I appreciate you. Thanks for teaching us all this morning. And yeah, have a great rest of the day. Send us some sunshine. We'll send you.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. And I think I talked to the residents later today, so I'll talk to
Oh,
some of them
good.
soon.
Nice. That's awesome.